yeah, if you do have to duck out, you can watch this at a later date. Some good news. Our friend Wally the Wombat is back. So
he's back.
He is back. So just a reminder, you need to look out for this fellow here in the slides coming up. He will be hidden. He's a little bit trickier to spot than our first module. So make sure you've got your glasses on. And yeah, he'll be appearing in today's module. This one is not included in the count. So you're currently at 0 Wallies, but make sure you're looking out for them. I did just want to quickly touch on, I mentioned in the previous module about this idea of a floating bus stop, and I just thought I'd show an example of this. This one is in Manchester, Oxford Road in the UK. And you can see that the bicycle lane is kind of being offset from where, you know, it traditionally was on the road. I'll just show it on the aerial there. So this is where the bike lane is. Kind of got a buffer zone there, but it's an on-road facility. And it gets shifted off-road behind all the bus shelters and things like that. And the benefit in that is if you've got pedestrians kind of exiting the bus or as they're getting onto the bus, they don't need to interact with cyclist traffic. Cyclists kind of have their own little freeway that runs behind all of that. So you've just good way to minimize the conflict between people accessing the buses and your cycling traffic is this idea of a floating bus stop. Another example of this is in Geelong, and I think we've got some participants who would be familiar with this site. But this one is actually showing the bus stop and waiting area kind of on the path itself. And what they've done here is they've raised the cycling facility so that cyclists, as they approach this conflict point, are forced to slow down and, you know, recognize that this is a pedestrian priority area. So another really good design and a really smart way to be able to reduce the likelihood of any conflicts there between bus users and your cyclists. So bravo to the Geelong team. I also wanted to just touch on one more on-road cycling treatment that we didn't touch on in the previous module, and it's this idea of a bicycle boulevard or advisory bicycle lanes. There's a few different terms used internationally to describe this. The way that it works is there is, within your general cross section or the carriageway, the way that it would look is you'd have dedicated bicycle lanes on both sides of the carriageway. And instead of allowing for 2 lanes of traffic in both directions at all times, you only allow for 1 lane of traffic, and basically both traffic streams have to share. So in this cross section here, you can see we've got bicycle lanes either side, and then we've got 1 central lane for traffic that allows for movements in both directions. Now, these are only used where you've got really low volumes of vehicles. You obviously don't want to see a massive thoroughfare of vehicles. Otherwise, there'd be lots and lots of interaction between vehicles trying to give way and hopping into the bicycle lane. So you don't want to have lots of vehicles. Just to show you what this looks like, this is an example out of Canada in Ottawa, where this width, as I mentioned before, is only enough to house 1 traffic stream at a time, so 1 direction at a time. If another vehicle was approaching, they do require to actually get over into the bicycle lane and, you know, briefly access that spot before passing the opposing vehicle and then continuing back into the traffic stream. So as I mentioned, low traffic volume, low speed, that's really where you want to be investigating this type of treatment. And that's just an example of the supporting signage that can be used within this. And I can see in the chat there that there is an example of this in Napier Street in Fitzroy. Let's give a prize out to Carmen there, which I'm just going to go through at the moment. So this was implemented a couple of years ago now, and this was part of the engagement that they use. They developed this video just to show residents and the community how this type of feature works. So this is just little snapshots from the video, but we've got a vehicle there that is traveling northbound, and you can see the cyclists in their dedicated lanes there. If they were to spot an oncoming vehicle, both vehicles need to slow down and access the adjacent bike lane in order to be able to safely pass one another. Once they've made that passing movement, then they can get back into their traffic lane. So it also acts as like a bit of traffic calming, because instead of having this wider carriageway, you've narrowed the space, which tends to make motorists slow down too. So here's what it looks like out on the ground. Yeah, it is in that kind of residential zone where it's not a massive throughput of traffic, and yeah, you're not expecting high speeds there. Hopefully everyone managed to see the 360-degree video footage that we provided for Module 2. We did showcase 2 different examples of on-road cycling infrastructure. Example 1 was a protected bicycle lane, and example 2 was riding against the dooring zone. Would love to hear your feedback in the chat if you had any grievances or experiences or perspectives that you'd like to share about either of those examples. But today's focus will be on intersections. So a lot of the design guidance that we refer to within this module is out of this document called, very appropriately named, Don't Give Up at the Intersection. For many decades, it's been very common for designers to, provide some type of cycling facilities mid-block, and then at the intersection, it was just deemed a little bit too difficult, or there's just not enough space to cater for any cyclist facility, and it's just been completely removed. So there's lots and lots of examples across our networks where you may have a bicycle lane at mid-block and then nothing at the intersection. And what we'll discuss today is, well, what can we be doing, better than that nothing? What would be considered best practice, which is this idea of a protected intersection. We'll talk about exactly what a protected intersection is, the design elements of that. We'll look at some international examples as well as the one in Melbourne here. And then we'll talk about more common types of intersections, signalized intersections, and talk about things like head starts, left turn and through treatments, which is kind of where that slip lane or interchange discussion that we were talking about last time will come into play. The idea of hook turns and bicycle signals as well. That's one.
Hello, Max. Just before you get stuck into the intersections, just a couple of questions on the cycle boulevards.
Yes.
I guess what happens with the bicycle boulevard if there's a vehicle collision? How do you know who's responsible if there's no demarcation?
So the way that I kind of view the bicycle boulevards is, if you pictured a residential street where you may have a parking lane, a traffic lane, and then a parking lane, it's just a narrow environment. And if you were driving along, you just pick that middle lane and you just have to pull over into little driveways and things like that to give way to people. And, it is already a shared lane environment. The bicycle boulevards have that exact same premise, except all they've done is they've continued a bicycle lane through there. So cyclists aren't forced to kind of weave in and out of traffic. They've got a consistent facility. Yeah. So my answer to that is, I don't really know who legally would be at fault if there were a collision there, but I would reflect on how would the current legal realm look at other scenarios where we have those residential streets and there's only that one traffic lane. So it doesn't really answer your question, but that's probably what I'd look at.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of pretty similar to a lot of, streets within urban Melbourne where you've got the parking either side and traffic basically goes down to one way in certain situations. And it's just a matter of politeness, I guess, of who has right of way and who's got the space to pull over.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah, that's kind of how it works. Yep.
And just another one before you get started. In the examples, would you consider the first example less safe along a stretch of road with several side streets and driveways? Sort of like the example in the assignment from the last module. I would think the parking has the potential to create site distance restrictions.
Yes, absolutely. Parking does create site distance issues. And if you are able to, create those additional buffered spaces adjacent any of those conflict points near the driveways or minor streets to open up the sightlines, that's definitely a good suggestion. But I would still be advocating for any degree of separation over having an on-road facility next to the dooring zone and adjacent the live traffic stream. Because, yeah, based on actual safety records, we know that that is a better outcome. And also the perception of safety. Cyclists feel more comfortable riding in that protected facility.
Great. Thanks, Max.
And Marissa.
Max, what is the preference for car parking design in that situation? Caitlin's saying it looked like angled parking with reversing out into the bike lanes. Would it inherently be better to force rear in parking?
We had this discussion in the previous module, so I'm not overly familiar with enforcing rear angled parking. I know a few examples of it, but I don't really know, the exact benefits of going with that approach. In the bicycle boulevard example that was shown, it was actually a combination of both angled parking and parallel parking. So depending on which side of the carriageway you're on, it had a bit of a combination of both. And going back to my previous comment on it, I would suggest if you were looking at trying to transform what that scenario looked like, and you did have some money to do things, and you couldn't do protected bicycle lanes, I would be looking at trying to shift those angled parking bays to parallel bays that then had a buffer, because presumably you've already got that width available there. So trying to reallocate that to have the parallel bay, which would be 2.4 meter wide or whatever it is, and then say half meter or a meter buffer, and then the bicycle lane, that would probably cater for the entire angled parking width that's currently available.
Thank you, Max. I'll leave you to get started on the content.
Thank you very much. So this is an artistic rendition of a protected intersection. This one is the one out of Melbourne, which has since been installed. So we'll also have a look at how things look currently. But what you should be able to see that's a little bit different about this design as opposed to conventional intersections is at each quadrant or corner of the intersection, there's these little build outs, or what's referred to as corner refuge islands. And they're deliberately there to slow down this left turning vehicle. So they've got quite a tight radius on them, so vehicles don't just take a nice sweeping bend along there. And they also provide an offset from where the bicycle lane was to where it is as they're crossing. So a cyclist traditionally would cross, no, it's not letting me draw it here, would traditionally cross about there, but through the use of the corner refuge islands, you've got this greater offset from where that left turning vehicle is and where the cyclist is. And that is actually incredibly important, providing that offset. So that's the main design feature of a protected intersection. And I'll go through some actual examples so you can appreciate the importance of that. Now, as I mentioned before, conventionally, we have our bicycle lanes right up against left turning vehicles. So they're typically running curbside. And what that means is as a vehicle is turning left to access the adjacent street, it's very difficult for them to be able to see cyclists that may be on their inside. So they may be hidden from their wing mirrors and also in their rear view mirror. they're in the blind spot. And as they're actually performing a left turn movement, they're not really at the focus point of vehicles that are driving. So that red diagram there is the motorist's sight lines, or where they're most focused. And the reason that's occurring is because you've got this minimal offset from where the bicycle lane is to where that left turning traffic lane is. So there's not enough space there to adequately accommodate to maximize those sight lines. Conversely, when we look at a protected intersection, the main thing that we are trying to do is maximize our sight lines. So we are deliberately increasing this offset. So that the offset is just another word for the distance. So we're increasing the distance between the bicycle lane and the left turn traffic lane. And what that means is, as vehicles come around to do a left turn, cyclists that are crossing are much more, within the windscreen of a vehicle, as opposed to being in the periphery or at their left passenger back left door kind of thing. So they're no longer hidden. So it's a much better way to be able to design things. If you've got the ability to be installing these types of facilities, it just helps to maximize those sight lines. So here's another example. This is taken out of the TMR document, Selection and Design of Cycle Tracks, and how a conventional intersection differs from a protected. So you can see with the protected, we've got the use of those corner refuge islands that I mentioned before. They're really, really important to ensure that we've got motorists tracking the path that we want, as opposed to just taking a nice sweeping bend. And they're really there just to ensure that that offset is being maintained. Yeah. Another example here of the conventional on the left. I'm not really sure you'd call that a conventional, because typically there'd be no separation between the bicycle lane there and the left turn traffic lane. But if you put yourself in the perspective of a vehicle that was turning left at this location, also given the skew of this particular intersection, it's just incredibly difficult for a left turning vehicle to be able to sight a cyclist, because they're not within their field of vision. If we compare this to the protected intersection, where we've got cyclists riding along here and then a left turning vehicle coming along here, you've managed to make that conflict points much closer to perpendicular. And we know that when we have conflict points as close to perpendicular as possible, you really are maximizing that sightline benefit. So that's kind of where the principle comes from. The more acute that angle is, the harder it is for motorists to be able to see. Whereas if you're able to make that conflict point perpendicular, you've got a better chance of cyclists being seen in those instances. Now, this is taken out of the MassDOT Separated Bike Line Planning and Design Guide. And just a heads up, the terminology that they use is slightly different to what we would use, and also their jurisdictional way that they do line marking and things like that differs to what we would do, but it's still a fantastic thing to reflect, and we just take this on a principle level and obviously adopt what we would do within our jurisdiction. So the first item there within this diagram is the corner refuge island, which I've mentioned a few times now. That is to slow down vehicles as they're turning left and tightening up the radius of that, so vehicles, can't just sweep across that left turn. We've got an area here, number 2, where cyclists actually have a spot to be able to queue. So that is an area where, when their light is red, they've got their own hold line or stop line, and space for them to be able to, wait there for their phase to go and then continue their journey. It's outside the carriageway. Well, it's outside the traffic lanes, so you don't need to worry about, putting yourself in front of vehicles or anything like that. It's separated from that. Number 3 is what's referred to as a motorist yield zone, or basically an area where motorists are able to, slow down and give way to any cyclists that are crossing there. Also, you notice that the pedestrian facilities are adjacent to the cycle lanes, so motorists are required to yield to both cyclists and pedestrians that are crossing in that space. Number 4 is a pedestrian crossing area. As I mentioned, we're separating those two users. This is really, really relevant at these types of intersections, because prior to this intersection, generally what happens is you may have either an on-road bicycle lane or a separated facility, and cyclists would have that, facility that is dedicated for them conventionally, which means you'd have cyclists riding at quite high speeds. Now, if you were to have this, separated bike lane, and then at the intersection points, make cyclists share with pedestrians, that's actually quite a big risk, because cyclists are then, traveling at speed and having to weave in and out of pedestrian traffic, or, potentially swerve out of the way and go into the traffic lane to avoid that situation. And anyway, it's a much better practice to be able to just separate those two vulnerable road users. So particularly at intersections. So you can see you've got the bicycle crossing point, and then you've got the pedestrian crossing point adjacent to that. Two separate facilities. It's not a shared space. Number 5 here, I'm also a big fan of, which is showing that the zebra crossing or the pedestrian crossing is prioritized across the bicycle lane. So cyclists that are traveling from the right, they get this acknowledgement that the zebra crossing applies across their bicycle lane. They need to slow down and give way to pedestrians crossing within that space. I'm a really big fan of that, because it just quite clearly articulates who has priority, and it also highlights where that conflict point is. So it's good to have cyclists slowing down and giving pedestrians the priority of that space. Number 6 is just pedestrian curb ramp or some type of pram ramp, just to be able to get pedestrians back up onto footpath level. Now, all of those terms are what is used if you were to be completing a design or anything like that, but I'm much more of a fan of just showing how these things work in the real world and how they've been applied. So I'm just going to get stuck into showing you some examples. This one is out of the Netherlands, and it shows a conventional intersection and how it has transformed into a protected intersection. So currently this is the conventional intersection. And the leg that I'm going to focus on is the northern leg. It's a little bit difficult to see, but there is this little ... situation happening on the curb side. That's the bicycle lane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the path of a cyclist that wanted to travel through this intersection here. It looks something like this, staying somewhat close to the curbside because that's where the bike lane is designated. And in another color, I'm going to draw the left turn movements of a vehicle within that space. So left turn vehicle, something like that. I should also mention that this image has been flipped. They drive on the right-hand side, but I've just mirrored this to make it a little bit easier for this. Now, if you put yourself in the perspective of a vehicle that is turning left, very difficult for you to be able to see a cyclist that is on your left-hand side and potentially behind you. What I also wanted to highlight is that angle there, as I mentioned before, is very acute. And we know that we don't have very good sight lines when we have acute angles. So we want to try and get as close to perpendicular as possible. This is the same intersection as it looks today. It is a protected intersection now. And I'll do the same exercise where I'll demonstrate how both cyclists and vehicles travel through this area. So a cyclist would kind of come off to this off-road facility, and then they may have to pause there, wait for their phase to go. You can see that there is a hold line there or a stop line there. Once they get the go, they're able to cross over, and there's actually an off-road path there, or they could go back up onto the road there. But that's the general movement now. If we have a look at how vehicles perform their left turn movement in this scenario now, it looks something a bit more like this. And that angle there is much closer to perpendicular. So you've really done a great job by installing this protected intersection by maximizing those sightlines. And you can also see at each quadrant or corner of this intersection are those corner refuge islands. So that's still being provided. That's really what helps to facilitate this design. Here's what it looks like out on the ground, and I'll go to the next photo as well, and I'll open this up to the chat as anything that they may see that is a little bit peculiar about this site, or a little bit odd. And I'll check in with Catherine and Marissa to make sure I haven't missed any questions.
I have a couple of questions for you, Max. Aside from better improved field of vision, would you say reduced impact angle is also a consideration?
Yes, I think so. Particularly if you had like heavy vehicles turning left at those acute angles, that's really where you've got a pretty significant risk of cyclists getting caught under tires and things like that at the acute angles. If it's more perpendicular, you know, it's, I guess, cyclists may be thrown onto the bonnet where there could be safety protection devices installed on general traffic. But yeah, the main benefit that you're looking at here is the sidelines. But yeah, to another extent, the actual crash severity could be reduced as well.
Thanks, Max. We had a comment about corridors in tight existing spaces. Will you be taking us through some examples of space, like where space constraints are, where separation is not achievable, because of space constraints?
Yeah, we do have a look at other examples of intersection configurations where protected intersections aren't available, but just for the first half of this module, we're going to focus on this element.
Yeah, great. All right, well, lots of people have spotted Wally, that's for sure. Good pick up.
Well,
yes.
There we go.
We're
You
on
got a
the
free Wally
ball.
there.
Yeah.
The answer that I was looking for, and Marissa, I'll let you pick out a winner here, is that we've got kind of one level throughout here. The curb is not raised, which is very unusual and not something that would really recommend or we'd be doing here within our jurisdictions, because remember I said this is right hand side, so a vehicle that was turning right, you know, could quite easily just go across this corner refuge island, really reduce the effectiveness of this treatment. So within our jurisdictions would be certainly advocating to create a raised corner refuge island, and yeah, reduce that as a risk. But this is the Netherlands, where, you know, slowing down for cyclists is very much ingrained within their culture, so they can probably get away with, you know, these slight little odd things. Another example here, this one is in Maryland in the USA, and it's got those similar design features that we can see, the corner refuge islands at each of the quadrants. And interestingly as well, on this northern side, it is a bi-directional facility. So all the other legs are one way. That leg, for whatever reason, or actually for this reason, it is a bi-directional facility. So just something to keep in mind. If you are doing protected facilities, protected intersections, you can do them as bi-directional. Now, I've got another question for the group, and for those that may have noticed, we've got this legend down the bottom left, and it says that there is proposed concrete or stamped concrete that's shown there, and then the red is proposed brick. So there's these two separate materials being used. My question for the chat is, why do you think that is being offered within the design? And I think, yes, I can see the answers coming through there. So the answer that I'm looking for is that is a mountable apron. I'll show what that looks like out on the ground. And so that is the grey concrete there, and the red brick is the raised part. The mountable apron is designed so heavy vehicles or long vehicles are able to perform their movements without having to drive on top of curbs. So basically you do a swept path analysis, you look at your swept path diagrams, and you'd see, you know, what is the longest vehicle that I'm expecting here, and it could be a bus or it could be a garbage truck or whatever it is. And you actually do a simulation and you make them do a left turn or a right turn in this instance. And you can see exactly the space that they require. That space you would set back and provide a mountable apron, and that would be at your limit of where that kind of curbed area is. However, general passenger vehicles are certainly encouraged to still take the edge of the mountable apron. So they don't require all that additional space. They're still being encouraged to take that, you know, tighter radius curve there. It's a super common thing to be installing. You may have seen it like in roundabouts and things like that. Mountable apron. So just wanted to clarify that if you are doing protected intersection design, have to think about your heavy vehicles and how they would be able to access the area. Another example here that I've got is in the United Kingdom. This one is also in Manchester. And the reason I wanted to show this one is because I think it's quite a unique example where if a cyclist wanted to turn right at this intersection, so just say that they're coming from the left of screen, this is kind of the journey that's being offered to them. You know, they'd travel along, they may get the green or they may get the red, they may have to pause there. Once they get the green, they can continue and turn around here in a little queuing area. Again, they'd have to pause there and wait for their green phase. Once they get the green, they're able to continue on their journey there. Now, as you look at that particular journey, it doesn't look overly painful or anything like that, but some cyclists may see that as overly circuitous and not something that they really want to do, and they just want to get from A to B as quickly as possible. And so what's actually also provided in this example is you can see these giant bike boxes, some of the biggest I've probably seen. What that is, to some extent, demonstrating is that cyclists who are more comfortable, you know, you can use the bike box. You can position yourself within the traffic lane, and if you wanted to turn right, you can use the right turn lane, just like general traffic does. Pause here, wait for a gap in traffic, and then turn right. So this particular example, in my mind, caters for cyclists that are both, you know, perhaps very, very comfortable riding on road and mingling with traffic, and they're used to doing that. And, you know, they just want to get from A to B as fast as possible. All the way to the other side of the spectrum where cyclists that don't feel comfortable mixing with traffic at all and want separated facilities everywhere. It really provides both of those skill levels, which I think is a really good way to be able to do these types of things. Other people have the opinion that no, we should always just be providing the safest option, and cyclists need to take that. And if they don't, then that's their decision, that's their risk, but we can't be encouraging anything else. And I guess I just don't subscribe to that type of thinking, because we need to acknowledge that the cycling community is more than just one stereotype, and you can say, you know, this is what you need to use, but there'll be 100 different cyclists that will say, no, that's not at all what I need to use. So I like this idea of trying to cater for a greater diversity in cycling. Here's what it looks like out on the ground, and it's just another photo of it here. This one is also flipped for those that may have noticed, where the pedestrian facilities are like on the inside of the intersection and the cyclists are on the out. The other ones had the other way around. This is a less common arrangement. And the way that they have actually demarcated where pedestrian conflict is you can see they've highlighted this section in yellow because that's where pedestrians are crossing over the bicycle path. As I mentioned before, I prefer the use of the zebra crossing because that's much more universal and much more understood, but perhaps that's just how they do things in Manchester. So I'm not 100% sure if that's just their practice there. I'll pause and check in with my colleagues to see if I've missed any questions.
What is the cyclist safety on slip lane, as this is not controlled by traffic lights? Oh,
So,
general.
yeah, so where there's not quite a slip lane here, but I think it might be referring to this section here, where you've kind of got, or this section here, where you've got cyclists that may need to slow down and give way to other cyclists within that space. And the way that that is achieved in these examples is through the use of that kind of give way dotted line marking. So those line markings are the visual cue for cyclists to be aware that, you know, they may have to slow down and give way to other cyclists crossing over that space.
Thanks, Max. There's no other questions. Lots of chat happening in the chat, but yeah, no other questions at the moment.
No worries. Okay. Well, we'll continue with the content and we'll get stuck into Melbourne's protected intersection. So this is an aerial image of how things looked prior to any intervention. And I think I'll focus on the right-hand side of the screen, the bottom right-hand side, to be specific. And you can kind of see the footpath there. Next to it, there is a protected bicycle lane. And then there's the parking lane. So cyclists riding in here have got a protected facility. And then at that point there's nothing. So this is an example of giving up at the intersection because there's no bicycle facility from that point all the way to the hold line. There is this little bicycle box situation at the intersection, but on approach to the intersection, there's absolutely no separated facility or, you know, shared environment or anything like that. So it's just a free-for-all, which is not a great outcome, but unfortunately something that is very, very common. And just while I'm focusing on this side as well, just to talk about the stand-up lane. So that's just the lane configuration on approach at this intersection. I've got a left turn traffic lane. I've got a through lane and I've got a through and right lane. So there's 3 traffic lanes in the previous state. Now, this is half and half of how things look before and after. And for those who have done any traffic congestion analysis may have noticed that I've eaten up one of those lanes. So I've now got a through and left lane for the traffic and a through and right lane. And does that cause congestion issues? Yes, if you are solely focused on improving congestion, then this is probably not the project for you or the treatment for you, but this specific intervention is focused on cycling safety. So where you do have your, you know, strategic cycling corridors or your most important aspects of your cycling network, and you're looking at trying to improve the intersections along those corridors, this is a real, you know, game changer that can help improve those things. And I do advocate that can be at the cost of, you know, congestion or driver frustration or things like that, because there's lots of other parallel routes in this instance that are arterial roads that could instead be used for the throughput of traffic. And this one can instead be, strategically prioritized for cycling. Anyway, before I get too much on a rant about that, just looking at that leg that I was showing before as well, that protected facility is now carried up all the way to the intersection. So there's no commingling or, just dropping off the bicycle lane. That protection is provided all the way. And I'll go one slide further and I can show you, this is the completed protected intersection. Once again, all 4 quadrants, we can see our corner refuge islands. And this is how things are currently operating at this intersection. To give you a bit of detail about this site, we've because it was an innovative project, it was the first of its kind within Melbourne. It did require, some significant thinking and lots of engagement. And one of the things in particular that stakeholders were concerned about was the idea of the corner refuge islands and how they would be perceived by users, both motor vehicles and cyclists. And that particular design element went through an iterative process before it went to construction. Now, when it first got sketched up, it looked something like this, just a tiny little jelly bean, and then there was some comments on, well, is that really going to be enough? Just this small little curve to make sure that vehicles are really slowing down and taking a tight radius around this left turn. And there was a little bit of thinking, and it was like, no, perhaps not. Maybe we should increase that corner refuge island, which was how we got to this example, number 2. Then there was some swept path analysis done, and they didn't really like how this wasn't really one smooth radius curve all the way through. It was a little bit hit and miss. So we got to iteration number 3, where we saw a much smoother radius for that corner refuge islands. Then there's a bit of thinking about, well, we do know this is a very busy commuter route for cyclists, and we are expecting to see, multiple cyclists having to queue and wait at this intersection. So perhaps we need to shave off some of that space adjacent the corner refuge island just to allow for more cyclists to be able to store, to be able to queue within that space. So they can see that that one got much narrower. We're now in the shape of kind of a boomerang. Finally, additional swept path checks were undertaken for those heavy vehicles, and those shaded areas were determined that that's where we'll need some mountable curbing, and the rest of it can be raised. So there was, as I said, an iterative process to get this to construction. A lot of the stakeholders still weren't 100% sure that this was the right decision for this intersection. Just because they hadn't seen it before, they hadn't tried it, they hadn't tested it. And so as part of the engagement, the project team decided to take those stakeholders that were part of this discussion. So yeah, people from the council, people from the bicycle user group within that area, the Department of Transport, different stakeholders involved. And what they actually did was, in an off-road facility, it was in a depot, completely away from general traffic, completely controlled, they built a 1-to-1 scale of this intersection. So they painted it all out exactly as it would be if it were to be installed. And they got all of those concerned stakeholders on their bicycles. And they also had a test vehicle that was turning left, turning right, going straight, going through, doing all the turning movements, and just saying, you ride through here and you tell me how you feel about this. And this is how they managed to get this project over the line, was just having that honest, transparent conversation with all those stakeholders. Stakeholders were also able to act as pedestrians, just so they got that perspective as well, and walking across. And yeah, it's just one of those jobs that required that additional engagement because it was innovative at its time and hadn't been applied within this particular setting. So there was a few skeptics, but yeah, this kind of approach helped to reduce that as a risk and has been installed since, which is very positive. And I think this image actually in particular shows what I'm kind of talking about with this offset that's being provided. So this left turning vehicle is in a much better position to see that cyclist who's about to cross over, as well as the pedestrian that's crossing as well. It's a lot easier to be able to spot those vulnerable road users because you've got that offset. The other thing that you may need to consider if you are doing protected intersections is, so we already spoke about, you know, considering our swept paths for heavy vehicles with relation to the corner refuge island, but they also may swing onto the oncoming traffic lane. And so that could also result in having to just push the hold line back a little bit. So you can see in this second example, the passenger vehicle can turn left there, no problem, but in the image on the right-hand side, the heavy vehicle requires additional space, and just a really simple design decision is to ensure that you've got your hold line set back there so that they're not encroaching into that space. Catherine.
Hello. A few questions, Max.
Go
Does it really matter if you turn a dedicated left turn lane into a through and left lane in the protected, intersection scenario?
Does it matter? So in terms of congestion, it would change things because then you've got the left turning that are potentially giving way to lots and lots of heads and cyclists. They're blocking that through lane as well. So in terms of congestion, it can have an issue, but in terms of safety of cyclists, which is I suppose the focus, having that left and through is probably negligible.
Just to clarify on that, Max, because there's parking there, just in relation to that question. So does it really matter if you turn a dedicated left turn lane into a through and left lane if 20 meters back that lane is a parking lane anyway? Apologies.
Gotcha. Well, that helped facilitate the construction of this one, is because you kind of already, I mean, that's really how a lot of our intersections work, is as you approach a signalized intersection, an additional lane just appears, which is in that case the dedicated left. Prior to that, that's where the parking lane was. So you've already had that roadway allowance. You've just, instead of allowing that for another traffic lane to eventuate, you've instead reconfigured that so that becomes the bicycle facility. So it's the same comment that yes, it will have implications on the congestion, but in terms of the way that the carriageway is set up is, you know, if you've already got the parking lane there, then you can probably, you know, you've got more space to play with.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Max. In some of the previous examples, do you think there is a risk that excessive road features, including line markings and coloured pavement, may overload road users' cognitive capacity, potentially leading to a safety hazard in itself?
It's a good point. So certainly we do know that if we clutter more and more of our roadside, particularly with signs, but there's line marking, as you say, you know, we can only process so much as humans, particularly as we're driving in those split seconds. So there's a balance. I'm not 100% sure where that line is, you know, X number of signs or too many changes in scenarios can confuse motorists. But I still think that there's also an argument on the other side of that saying that generally when motorists are confused and overwhelmed by lots of things, they slow down, which is kind of
exactly.
So I think that's probably a PhD topic to actually that in more detail.
Yes.
I'm not 100% sure where that cognitive overload exists. But certainly for signs, I've seen things go overboard very quickly.
Definitely. Yeah. No, good point. And is there any commentary about the Maury Street protected roundabout compared to the protected intersection on Albert Street?
We talk about that in next module, so I will
perfect.
definitely leave that for then.
Thank you. And just one more for you, Max. Are you not doubling up the footpaths? I can't see much difference between the footpath and the cycle lane, except from separation of the two. Like, wouldn't cycle lane off ramps onto footpaths have the same effect?
Gotcha. So the reason that we're advocating for this is because we're separating pedestrians and cyclists. So as cyclists are approaching this, they've got their own dedicated separated facility. So they're traveling relatively fast, kind of 20, 25, up to 30 kilometers per hour. If that were to just be brought on an on-ramp to the footpath, you can appreciate that that would be quite an uncomfortable experience for pedestrians. Particularly pedestrians with disabilities or mobility scooters or visual impairments and things like that. Having them to interact in that space at the intersection is not really an ideal scenario. So instead, they are separated spaces with pedestrians at that footpath level and cyclists in the adjacent area there.
Right. Thank you, Max. And I'll hand over to Marissa if Marissa's got any questions.
No questions over here.
worries.
Just lots of chat amongst the group. So no questions. Thanks, Max.
That's right.
Cheers.
I'll just finish on our protected intersections and then we'll have a little break. So I'll just get through this content. And I'll show you Melbourne's protected intersection from the perspective of a cyclist and particularly how it works adjacent a left-turning vehicle. So this is actually, as you can see, a taxi. This is me riding through. I'm cycling through this, and that taxi is turning left. Now, conventionally, a cyclist would be in the position shown with that yellow arrow. That green arrow obviously demarcates that left turn that that taxi is taking. In a split second forward in time, this is how things look. Once again, that yellow arrow represents where cyclists conventionally are. That green arrow is where that left-turning vehicle is turning. And then that purple arrow represents where the protected intersection pushes cyclists or where that offset is achieved. Now, where the yellow arrow is, hopefully that's very clear why, if you were in this situation as a cyclist and that left-turning vehicle was there, you're in a pretty dire situation because you need to make a decision as a cyclist. All right, that taxi driver has not seen me. I need to put on my brakes and, hopefully I can brake in time before a collision, or I need to speed up and pass that taxi driver. But having that offset there, as you'll see in the next slide, really opens up the sight lines for that taxi driver so that you're not as close to that yellow line. You've got further offset or further distance there. And if you actually look in the passenger window of the taxi, you can kind of see that that driver, their neck is facing directly towards me. So it's absolutely achieving what we wanted in this example. This guy's doing fantastic work. Yes, that was Ken on the corner with his bike. Good spotting there. Just wanted to mention that as we are approaching protected intersection, it is important to maintain sight lines, both for the cyclists and for the motorists. Actually, I've got another image that shows it a little bit better. But yeah, it's important that we've got clear sight lines, both from the vehicle's perspective, so that they are aware that there is a cyclist traveling through, and from the perspective of the cyclist, so they're aware if a motorist is turning left. And that is at all intersections, really. It's not just protected, but certainly in protected, you want to ensure that you've got clear sight lines before the conflict point. Now, I will pause here and give everyone a 4-minute break. So go out, have a stretch, and come back here in 4 minutes and we'll get stuck into some more content. Welcome back, everyone. We will get stuck in. I'll just check in with Catherine if there's any questions.
Hello. Yes, I did notice that someone else might be popping up in the cycling content. Just a few questions for you, Max. Any need or issues with the deviation for cyclists that they run into the jelly bean / curb?
Great question. That is actually an issue that occurred at Melbourne's protected intersection. A cyclist, well, several have struck it, but one in particular did ride straight into the corner refuge island and fell off and broke their arm. And what was done as kind of an immediate rectification was just to cover the corner refuge island with like those RRPMs or cat's eyes, just to make it, stand out more. Things that you could be looking at though is contrasting it. So, using a different color from the surrounding pavement is probably a very good one. So in the Maryland, USA example, you could see the texture of the red brick. Like that really helped to make that feature stand out.
Yeah.
Other than that, if you try and delineate the path, well and truly away from that corner refuge island, so rather than just assume that they can see that before they get to that point there, actually pushing them further offset would be another way that you could reduce that as a risk.
Yeah, thank you. Is there clear delineation in the road rules as to whose responsibility it is to give way at the cyclist through versus vehicle when turning left at the intersection?
So as soon as the vehicle puts on their left blinker, a cyclist must slow down and give way to a motorist. The issue with that road rule is if a cyclist is slightly ahead of that vehicle or right in the middle of that vehicle, they may not be able to see that a blinker is on. Also, a motorist may not put their blinker on to turn left. So that's kind of inherently got a few issues with the legality of that situation. But having this protected intersection design kind of reduces that as a risk as well. But that's kind of how the road rule works.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Another one, is there significantly less crash risk associated with these treatments from data? Furthermore, is it preferable to locate pedestrians on the inside of the intersection rather than outside, as shown in the Manchester example, to reduce walking distance and thus the likelihood of pedestrians following desire lines rather than travelling within provided facilities?
So the first part of the question, yes, there has been some research into this, that they do offer crash safety reductions. I can't tell you the exact percentage figure, but yes, that's why it's kind of being regarded as best practice at intersections, because we know that they do improve the safety for cyclists. As for the question, would you put pedestrians or cyclists on the inside, which kind of configuration? To me, it kind of makes more sense to have things consistent, which is pedestrians on the footpath adjacent, cyclists there, and then they cross like that, as opposed to forcing the pedestrians to cross over the bicycle lane to have like this little interior bit and then cross the intersection and then cross back over the bicycle lane. I think that kind of adds some conflict points. But then again, there may have been a reason for that specific configuration that I'm not aware of. So I would tend to just see them as whatever your configuration is leading up to that intersection, keep that consistent through the intersection and on the exit.
Yeah, great. Have we got time for a few more? Or
Yep.
Would you like to? Yeah. Has there been any post-construction safety audits done at these separated facilities to ensure that protected intersection causes less risk to cyclists?
Yes, lots and lots of safety audits done. Also, all those design scenarios that I was showing before, the iterative process, like that was all road safety audit picked up as well. So yeah. Gone through heaps.
Fantastic. Conventionally, a vehicle crosses the path of the cyclist, turns across the cycle lane. However, the cyclist is also aware of the vehicle and knows that they will need to brake. The separated intersection approach appears to change this perceived priority, but does this then result in rider complacency and potentially reduce skill set awareness of the cyclist?
So I understand what you're saying. Just from the motorist perspective, they are, I suppose, in some regard, used to having turn left and look for pedestrians. So they are kind of used to that already within our signalized intersections. We've also just added cyclists within that space as well. So for them, cognitively, I don't think it's too much of a significant shift. From the perspective of the cyclists, though, if you had, 10 of these protected intersections in a row, but there was one missing within that corridor that didn't have that same configuration, that's where I'd perhaps be a bit more concerned. But given that we are not seeing that these are installed regularly, there's few and far between examples of protected intersections. Queensland is probably doing the best at installing these. So shout out to those up north. There's lots of examples up there. I don't see it as a significant risk that cyclists would become complacent because they're generally quite aware of the risks that they are undertaking. In saying that, there's always a spectrum. So no, I wouldn't see it as a significant risk.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Max. And just one more. It's around traffic signal phasing. And understand that it might be different for each jurisdiction, but how would this kind of provision affect signal phasing, i.e. the bend that the cyclists have to follow instead of going straight through would require them to reduce speed and therefore increase left turn red hour pedestrian protection time. Otherwise, while a cyclist is trying to go around the refuge, a vehicle might just take their chance and go through, increasing chances of risk taking. These would be in the case cyclists don't have their own dedicated phase. There's a few things there.
Yeah, absolutely. So traditionally, these are installed with your dedicated cyclists, like head start. So they would get an opportunity to enter there prior to any of the vehicles, left-turning vehicles. With regards to, the time added by that offset, it may look more significant in the photos, but when you actually ride it, it's like that. So it's not like you're adding seconds to someone's journey by having that offset feature. And I think it's pretty minimal risk that a left-turning vehicle would, be able to maximize any of that delay caused to the cyclists. Just because, although if you did have like a significant offset, perhaps that could be a higher risk, but I don't think you'd be providing that feature.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Max. That's all from the Q&A section.
I'll go one more, Marissa, and then I'll continue on with the content.
Okay. If we are providing a raised crossing on a slip lane, what would be the minimum length to the raised crossing from the giveaway line?
The tricky one. I unfortunately cannot tell you the dimension at the top of my head there.
I'd have to refer over to our raised crossing course.
Yeah, we do have a raised crossing course. That's probably where this is covered. But I do have some slides later on that shows those slip lane arrangements and what can be looked at instead there. So hopefully that helps.
All right.
But I don't know the exact dimension.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
No worries. Now, I did want to do another little segment of course, my favorite component. And look who it is. Catherine here asking what's wrong with this photo. So this was a photo. Oh, actually, I'll give it out to anyone that knows where this may have been taken. And chuck in the chat what you think is wrong with this photo. Lots and lots going on here. Also in the chat if you know where this photo was taken. Country.
I might add to the chat and say I think something wrong with my face in that photo.
You're very confused. You're
just
a confused cyclist.
So confused.
You met the design brief very well.
Yes. I believe that was COVID days. My hair looks looks like it was down to my my waist. That's when the hair salons were closed.
There you go. Bringing back the memories.
Yes.
All right, so I can see lots of examples coming through. The country in question is Canada. And there are lots of things wrong with this. It is very confusing, so I agree with all of those comments. It's quite unusual altogether, the way that this is set up, but in particular, the most peculiar, I would say, is this diagonal crossing of an intersection. It's not a common arrangement. I'm actually not against it. I think if you've got a bidirectional on one side and you want to push it to the other side, you know, your choices are to bring cyclists across there and then do another one there, or go like that way and then that way. So having two phases there, or provide them this diagonal crossing. And there's multiple examples I can show you internationally where diagonal is being used, but I'm not aware of any that we do in Australia. So if you do know any, I would love to know. But yeah, I think that's just quite peculiar. As I said, I'm not against that. I just think it's certainly the easiest route for a cyclist to take. Now, we will be focused now on signalized intersections. So more conventional intersections where we don't have, you know, the money to be able to completely transform that situation, and instead just looking to improve things without the significant investment. So one of the really common things that are provided at signalized intersections are head start boxes or bike boxes. They've been in the Austroads guides for decades now. And it's basically just a dedicated area for cyclists at the top of the intersection to be able to prop and wait. Obviously, if they're in front of all the vehicles, they have got their best ability to be able to be seen. So that's the reason that you're doing it, is just to improve that visibility. There's a few examples shown within the Austroads guide of how this may be configured. And there's two kind of points to it that I think is quite useful to know. One is, as I said, the visibility of the cyclist in that facility. And the other thing is it can act as a means of wayfinding. So in example A or example B, they're both pretty similar. A cyclist riding in a bike box that looks like that, they may understand based on that feature that perhaps they can travel straight or turn left, but they're not really being encouraged to get over into the right lane. So it's not being extended all the way over there. And there could be a reason for that. So perhaps that right turn lane goes onto a highway where cyclist traffic is not being prioritized. So it can have that wayfinding function. Alternatively, if you did have a bicycle box across all the traffic lanes, it would be communicating to the cyclists that all of those turn movements are appropriate for me as a cyclist to be performing. So it kind of has that communication that these are all appropriate lanes for me to be holding up, because I could be wanting to go either left or through or right. The thing that I don't particularly recommend with this, within the Austroads guide, there are specific descriptions associated with when you may look to do A, B, C, or D. The example C, to me, is just bizarre and not one that I'd really recommend. Just having this really small bicycle lane in between the left and the through, and then also in between the through and the right, is a really uncomfortable experience. And not having the bike box kind of all the way across and just having two different bike boxes, I also think is just a weird thing. So C is not all that common, and not a really great design. Now, our left turn and through treatment, so where we are unable to do our protected intersections, how can we manage cyclist conflicts at these locations? So decades ago, as I mentioned, we did nothing at all. Well, this is something that is slightly better. It's not going to, absolutely eliminate the risk of crashes, but it will mitigate the risk. So one of the way is this example here, where you've got a bicycle lane that's perhaps separated, and then where they are leading up to the intersection, you get this use of sharrows. So using this idea of, okay, cyclists, you can now claim the traffic lane and ride in the middle of that lane. Even if you wanted to go straight here, you would still just position yourself in this left turn lane and go straight across like that. So that's quite common. Another way is to use this kind of bent out bicycle lane approach, which is, as you can see, keeping the bicycle lane consistent. So there is all of that bicycle lane through all the way up to the intersection, and highlighting the conflict point in green. So as a vehicle is turning left to access the left turn lane, they do have acknowledgement that they are crossing over a bicycle lane. Both of those are relatively common, probably the one on the right more so. I wanted to just share an anecdote with the group of how I used to ride into the office. I no longer live in this location, but I used to ride along this section very, very frequently to get to work. And on my ride to work, I was riding from the right to the left. And I was in this on-road bicycle facility, which was adjacent the dooring zone, so adjacent the parking lane. It's a 50km/h road here. And as you can see, as I'm riding along here, I get to about this point and there's this use of sharrows. So I am sharing the left turn traffic lane with general traffic. I get to the intersection, pause and wait there to get my green, and then that on-road facility continues on the other side. So that was my ride to work. Not an ideal scenario, but not the most stressful thing I've been riding in either. My ride home from work, however, once again, similar configuration, on-road bicycle lane next to the dooring zone. But this time I get to this point here and approach to the intersection, there's nothing. So the cycle lanes disappear completely. And instead, I've got to just position myself in the through lane. So push myself across and get into this position in between the left and the right in order to continue my movement through there. So much more stressful on my way home than getting to work. And I suppose that just really iterates, if you were within this space, you would ideally look to be, trying to apply your treatments consistently, certainly along the corridor, but also most definitely at the same intersection. It should be consistent no matter which leg you're on. So something to keep in mind. Now, with regards to those slip lanes, generally they don't fare very well for cyclist safety at all, because where you've got motorists crossing over the bicycle lane, it is an elongated period. So it's no longer just a distinct point. That's the conflict point. That's where motorists are crossing over the bicycle lane. You've basically got this entire area here where a vehicle may be colliding with a cyclist. So I'm sure for all those drivers out there, if you've ever crossed over these facilities, you tend to get quite nervous if there's a cyclist in that area, and it kind of heightens your awareness of the risks in this area. The reason being, it is such a long space that you are crossing over that bicycle lane. Now, what is currently done within this is, highlighting with conflict paint. So you can see the green paint is all used all the way along this. It's not just exclusively where that conflict exists. It's kind of prior to that point and after that point as well. I don't believe that's going to really solve, cyclist safety just by applying paint and line marking and things like that, but that is what is commonly done. What could be looked at instead is this idea of pushing cyclists to an off-road facility and then crossing over at a distinct location at the slip lane. So this is taken out of the Ostro's report. So pushing cyclists away from the carriageway, having them to pause and wait, or giving them priority across the slip lane before continuing on like that. You would also look to see if you could raise that conflict point. So as we spoke about before, raising those areas where we've got vulnerable road users crossing helps to reduce the risk of motorists just traveling through there at speed, and also gives cyclists a bit more confidence that they're able to ride through there with priority. Now, the reason I say that with the degree of warning, I suppose, is that generally cyclists that would be riding in environments like this, that's shown on this image here, this is 80 km/h road. If you were to provide a facility that looked like that was off-road, and then they had to cross over this slip lane and then get back on road, it's pretty unlikely they would use that, because those cyclists already using facilities like this are the super confident, you know, they're just going to go where it's convenient for them and they just understand the risks. So you may not necessarily have the best it may not necessarily be the best investment to be advocating for that specific infrastructure. However, in a perfect world, you know, where we've got all of these gold standard cycling corridors and we've got interactions with slip lanes, that's certainly what you'd be looking at doing, trying to provide those dedicated areas where the crossing point is very clear, it's limited, it's only this point here, it's not all of that section there. And if you were to raise it and provide priority to pedestrians and cyclists, that would be a much safer outcome. Okay, hook turns, something that we do very, very commonly here in Victoria, both in vehicles and on bicycles, is this idea of a hook turn. And the way that it works is basically, as a cyclist, you'd be turning left to go right, is the way that it's kind of referred to as. But it just means in your higher, you know, multi-lane environments, rather than you having to push yourself across to get into a right turn lane, you can just stay curbside and closer to the left turn lane and then perform a right turn. So if you're a cyclist riding on road in this example, you could position yourself in this little hook turn box. It is offset enough that through traffic can still continue and you're not going to block their passage. When you get the green to go, you're the first one out in front of that intersection and able to ride through there. This is just one example of an intersection that uses hook turn boxes, but as I said, they're really, really common down this side, and something that a lot of cyclists actually appreciate. And yeah, the benefit being that if you're a cyclist, you can perform a right turn in two movements, so one there and then one there, as opposed to pushing yourself in front of through lane and right turn traffic and then get into a right turn lane and do that. So it just allows for simpler right turn movements. If you were doing right turns at a T intersection, you could look at providing, you know, this kind of bicycle bypass. And this example shows that a right turning cyclist, they've got this little cutout that could be adjacent the curb and channel there. You'd ideally put a pedestal there so a cyclist can, you know, push on the little button thing, and that would slow or stop traffic in all directions, and then they could perform that right turn there. So another suggestion of how that could be used. Here's an example. This one is in Adelaide of this in use. It's not the exact same as that figure, but basically you've got this little bicycle bay area here. Cyclists push the button, and then to turn right, they cross over with the signalized crossing, and then they continue their ride along there. So it just saves them having to get across all those lanes of traffic to get into this right lane, which is very stressful. So you're just providing those facilities closer to where they are. This is not an example of a signalized intersection, but just a mid-block section that my colleague shared and I thought was pretty interesting. But yeah, the cycle lane goes from on-road to a shared path. So it goes from here to there. And rather than try and get cyclists crossing diagonally without any signals or anything like that and just trying to pick a gap, we're instead trying to get cyclists up onto the footpath, cross over there when you've got the gap, and then continue their journey. So just another way that you can manage that. All right, now I wanted to share another anecdote. This is another one of me cycling at this intersection, which, as you can see, is a very significant traffic and just congested intersection. There's also got light rail tracks down the middle of this road. The area that I'm going to be focusing on is this southern leg, where you can see there is a tiny little on-road bicycle lane and a little bicycle box thing. And here's what it looks like on the ground. And it is difficult to see because we're in shadow. But that little circled area there, adjacent the signal lanterns, is a bicycle signal. So although it's currently red, what actually occurs is a bicycle symbol goes green while everyone else is on red. And that is what's referred to as a bicycle head start. It can be anywhere between kind of 3-5 seconds. So cyclists can enter the intersection before any motorists. It's a wonderful thing as a cyclist. In this example, though, there was a slight confusion that I just wanted to share with the group, just so you're aware of how these things may be misinterpreted by the cycling community. So I've drawn a little diagram here of what that head start looks like. So that is the cyclists that have that head start facility. They're able to perform their through movements because they've got the green first, and then at some stage, as I said, 3, 4, 5 seconds later, general traffic enters. It does not cater for cyclists that were wanting to turn right at this intersection. So this particular example, I was wanting to turn right because my house was up here. So I wanted to go right and get home. I see the green bicycle signal go, so I automatically get on my saddle and I start riding through here and begin to turn right. As I mentioned though, those signals were only catering for cyclists going through. So at a particular point in time, I got about halfway through. And general traffic that were heading through, they get their green, which means you can get cyclists stuck in this really awkward position in the middle of an intersection where they need to make a decision to, ride on through and potentially block off a car that's heading through, or just pause and wait and pick a gap. So in that particular example, I think some supplementary arrows with the signals to demonstrate that this is the movement that is being permitted by cyclists would help to reduce the risk of that confusion, because surely I'm not the only cyclist that's had that as an issue. But it was not a near miss or anything like that for me. It's just an example of where I think engineering has perhaps misled, or created a misconception for cyclists in the cycling community. And that's talking to an engineer as well, so it's pretty significant. Bicycle signals, though, yeah, really, really common. we love them. They're a great idea. Gives cyclists a head start as they're entering intersections. It's just to put them in a more prominent position, so they're much easier to see, particularly if you've got queuing of cyclists. You know, if this was a commuter route, this is down in Perth, and you've got cyclists, you know, lining up to get through there. If you've got the bicycle light green, they get to go first, then you hopefully get a lot of those cyclists out entering the intersection prior to that through traffic getting the green or them turning left across. So a very good solution there. The final little bit of content that I wanted to get through today was just with regards to our temporary traffic management. It's not just relevant to intersections, it's relevant mid-block as well, and roundabouts and any other scenarios. But thinking about how our temporary traffic management and our detours and the like are catering for our cycling community, because unfortunately this scenario of bicycle lane closed, merge right is all too common. And two kind of ironic things about this is this photo was taken, the project that is being constructed is the protected roundabout, a protected intersection within Melbourne. So you're building this project that is really improving cycling safety, but during the construction, cyclist safety is not being prioritized, which is very ironic. The other irony is cyclists prior to this treatment, prior to this location, sorry, they have a separated facility. So you need to be thinking about, you would have cyclists that don't feel comfortable riding on road, and you've brought them up to this scenario here where they are forced to merge in with general traffic, something that they may not feel comfortable doing. So it's a really, really poor outcome. In these types of temporary traffic management scenarios, you can look at doing things like getting cyclists onto the footpath as, you know, a temporary detour. You'd obviously want to highlight that quite significantly, so both pedestrians and cyclists know that this is a shared space now. And but yeah, this idea of you can just close off the lane and that's it, job done. I think we need to be a little bit smarter about things like that and consider how that will affect our cycling community. Another good scenario is, imagine if you did that with just a general traffic lane. If you just said traffic lane closed, merge right, and that was it, you would certainly be getting some pretty angry calls coming through. So I do have another little exercise I wanted to get through, but I'll just check in with Catherine and Marissa to see if there's any questions they would like.
I just have one question from a little earlier on, and I'll just scroll back to it. In your experience, is it common for cyclists to interpret green pavement marking as they have right of way rather than this is a conflict zone? Proceed with caution.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say so. I tend to find cyclists see that as the conflict point as opposed to a priority kind of treatment. But that's just anecdotal, yeah.
Okay. No other questions in the chat, Catherine?
Yeah, just one that was brought up earlier when we were talking about head start boxes, Max, at intersections. Bicycle boxes on heavy vehicle routes and risk of blind spots in front of heavy vehicles.
Yeah, right. So heavy vehicles do have very, very significant blind spots, more than I think a lot of people would be aware of. There's actually a wonderful New South Wales advertising campaign that really demonstrates that incredibly well. It's perspective of a driver of a heavy vehicle. Here's what their view is, and then you look in their mirrors and there's no one around, and then, you know, they get out of the cabin and there's all these cyclists that were just completely hidden, like they're just in the blind spot, you have no idea.
Yeah.
So completely agree with that sentiment.
Yeah.
I would suggest by not providing the bike boxes, though, you're perhaps encouraging cyclists to wait adjacent that heavy vehicle, which in my mind is an even more significant and dangerous scenario for a cyclist. So
Yeah.
I would still be advocating for cyclists to be positioning themselves in front, acknowledging that there may be those sightline issues, and hopefully, there's no real simple way to answer that, but if you could step the hold line further back from where the bike box was, that would help to open up those sight lines a little bit more, rather than just being directly adjacent.
Yeah.
Good question, though. Let's give a prize out there. I haven't given enough prizes out today.
I like that question because that campaign, the advert campaign you mentioned, Max, is very effective in demonstrating that issue. And I guess, I mean, look, in an ideal world, a heavy vehicle route, you'd have a separated facility for cyclists, but we don't have the luxury of space and dollars. So a head start box is better than nothing on those routes. Yeah, taking into account the setback as well. I think that's a good point. Couple more questions have just come through in relation to the temporary traffic management discussion. Would it be best to reduce speeds to 20 kilometres per hour in the construction zone and make it a shared space?
Absolutely. If you were able to do that, I'd also be looking at trying to install maybe like speed cushions and things like that, so that motorists actually do drive at 20 kilometers per hour.
Yeah.
In South Australia, their work zone speed limit is 25 kilometers per hour. So perhaps you can use that as like a little bit of, see, they're doing it. But yeah, no, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. And yeah, you just addressed the other question that we had as well around reducing speed limits in temporary traffic management scenarios. I guess the other thing is ensuring that people are doing that speed limit, which is always the tricky, challenging thing in temporary traffic management scenarios.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Max.
No worries. I just wanted to provide some very brief feedback on the Module 2 assignment. So thank you for those that have already submitted the assignments. We've seen a lot of those already come through and the submissions are looking excellent. We do have quite a bulk to get through, so apologies if you haven't received your grade yet, but rest assured we'll be getting through it. We're chipping away. One item that I wanted to discuss, which was directly related to the content that we've gone through today, is actually the first intersection, which is at the very west of this site at Wellington Street. And for those that haven't done the assignment and want to include this as a treatment or a recommendation or a risk, please don't, because I'm just, I'm not trying to get people just to copy the words that I'm saying. I'd rather you create your own risks and recommendations, but just for those, just wanted to share this as an example of what does occur. So along York Street here, I've got a left lane and a left and through lane into Wellington Street. Now, I've provided these little cars figures to help explain what I'm about to show here. But if I've got, say, a line of vehicles and they're all waiting for their green, and I've got a vehicle here on the outside as well, and then I got my cyclist that's traveling at this location. This could be a real scenario, okay? Got a line of cars, all of them wanting to turn left. Now, this cyclist may want to be performing a through movement, which would look something like this. There's no separated facility there. There's no protected intersection here. So you can see we've already got that situation where we've got very poor sight lines in between the left turn traffic and this cyclist that's heading through. So this vehicle on the inside, if they were wanting to turn left, so say the light goes green, they've got a movement that looks something like this. and that angle there is quite acute. So there's not horrific sight lines there. But also of quite significant concern is this vehicle on the outside, the reddish vehicle, cannot see the cyclist. So they have their sight lines masked, is the term that's used. Another term that's used is dynamic visual obstruction. So dynamic just means it's not like static. It's not like there's always something there that is blocking sight lines. It's dynamic. It's moving. So it's only in certain times. And what this means is this vehicle, who could potentially want to be doing a left turn as well, they can't see the cyclist that's crossing there. They may see the green motorist on the inside lane there, starting their left turn, and then just assume that they're also good to go, completely unaware that there could be a cyclist crossing in that space. So if you're ever doing multi-lane crossings, dual lane crossings with 2 turn lanes adjacent to each other, this risk of masking becomes quite important and quite significant. So I just wanted to share that with the group. Some of you may be already familiar with examples like that, but yeah, it's something, if you were auditing this design as part of a road safety audit, you'd be picking that up as a fairly significant risk and, you know, looking to try and reduce that and hopefully designing that out so it's no longer there. Anyway, I just wanted to include that. The work for today is we've got within our LMS another 360-degree video to review. So this one will be on intersections. You will get to see what it feels like riding through Melbourne's protected intersection and do a right turn. Unfortunately, there was a lot of traffic that day. So I'd actually recommend is, rather than look at me and listening to what I'm saying in the preamble, just spin around 180 degree and watch the traffic to see how they are interacting, because it's quite a unique little snapshot to see how everything's going. So you'll get to see the protected intersection, and then you'll also get to see how it feels riding through a more traditional intersection. So we'll get you to review that prior to our next lesson. And then there's also the quiz. So just like our previous ones, you just click on that. It will take you to, the quiz, and you'll get 3 attempts to get 80% or higher on that. And looks like I've managed to finish with a little bit of extra time. So you've got some time now to watch that video and complete that quiz. But I will check in with Catherine and Marissa and see if I missed anything there.
Too much. We've got a comment. Can't the cyclists use the pedestrian crossing? Obviously referring to
they could, but the pedestrians would be in the same predicament there, because they would also be likely, depending on how the phasing works, but they would likely also be crossing when that left turn has that movement as well. So they would also have that masking risk.
Anything else from me, Catherine?
No, all good, Max. All good.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great opportunity for you to complete your Module 2 assignment if you haven't done that already and upload it to the LMS, or just get stuck into the Module 3 video and the Module 3 assignment quiz. And we will see you on Friday. Jump in early and we'll get some trivia for the team.
Yes, absolutely. And will Wally be back on Friday, Max?
No Wally on Friday.
Oh.
There's no Wally on Friday. So this is the final Wally.
Oh, well,
He's having a long weekend, isn't he?
Yeah,
he's got to take it easy. He's having a rest.
Wally doesn't work Friday. Someone said, "Yeah, me
Yeah.
either."
Good day to have off, everyone, including Wally.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for the great session.
Yeah.
Oh, just a quick question. Sorry. Just one.
Oh.
When is the quiz due? James would like to know.
The quiz.
The quiz, so in order to successfully complete the course and obtain your certificate. You just need to complete all the tasks. So no specific due date on the quiz, but you know, the content's fresh in your mind. It's better off just to get it done while you can. But as long as you complete all of the tasks, you'll be able to successfully complete the course.
Terrific. Thanks very much.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.